Welcome to Natural Habitat Adventures Daily Dose of Nature, Humans and Wildlife in the American West, a History, presented by wildlife biologist and expedition leader, Aaron Bott. Thank you for being here today, Aaron. I'm going to hand things off to you.
Thank you very much. Thanks everyone for tuning in. This is an exciting topic for me. I was just talking to Kendall about this, but history in the American Intermountain West is kind of a hobby of mine, and so I requested to be able to give this presentation, and I'm happy to see that there were a lot of people interested in it. So hopefully I don't disappoint. First off, I'd like to acknowledge that today is Veterans Day, so thanks to all you veterans out there for everything that you've done for us. We're going to be talking about the United States and wildlife and human history here in what we call the Intermountain West. Specifically, I wanted to incorporate 3 areas where Natural Habitat offers trips or expeditions. I want to talk a lot about the Southwest trips into the canyons, which includes Grand Canyon National Park, as well as Bryce Canyon and Zion. I also want to talk about the greater Yellowstone ecosystem, so Yellowstone National Park, of course, and Grand Teton National Park, which is featured here in this photograph, as well as the Glacier National Park up in the northern continental divide ecosystem on the Canada-Montana border. So without further ado, I think we'll go ahead and get started. Really quick, a background about me and why I'm so interested in this particular subject. I'm a wildlife biologist. I study large carnivores primarily. I work with federal and state agencies to research wildlife and to study wildlife in hopes to mitigate human wildlife conflicts and to hopefully create a better future for wildlife, particularly large carnivores, in a world that is experiencing a growing human population. But intimately for this presentation, I'm also a 7th generation Westerner. My family has lived in the American West for 7 generations. Both sides of my family had moved out here back in the 1840s and the 1850s. If you can't see the family resemblance, maybe look again, but these are some of my ancestors, some of my forebears that again moved out west. My family, quick history, they joined the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints back in the 1840s and in the 1850s. Interestingly enough, both my father's ancestors and my mother's ancestors joined that church over in Europe, and at the time there's a great movement for immigration and for members of this church to move west, and I'll talk a little bit about that later because it plays an important part in our story of how humans settled the West. I should say Euro-Americans settled the West, which brings me to another point that I'd like to make. In today's discussion, I'm talking about the human-wildlife interaction in the American West over the last 200 years. And I'm going to do a huge disservice to those of you who are interested in learning about Native American populations and peoples and histories and cultures here in the American West. The history of those peoples inhabiting these regions are rich, they're wonderful, and these peoples definitely have an incredible amount of knowledge and influence over their environment here. Not just historically, but today they remain on the landscape, and they still interact with the wildlife and the environment just as much, if not more so, than some of our Euro-American settlers and homesteaders here. But today I'm going to primarily be talking about the Euro-American westward expansion and the settlement of the West by Euro-Americans. I wanted to talk more about some of the indigenous peoples in this region, but I'm afraid we're just going to have to leave that for a different presentation. The experiences and knowledge that we have learned from them, that they have shared, they're just so wonderful, but also so deep that I felt like it would be an injustice to try and cram it all into one presentation today. So without further ado, again, I'd like to start off by talking about the American West and humans and wildlife here in the Americas, specifically in the Intermountain West. just a moment ago, my friend Nicole, who's a habitat biologist, stepped into my office, and she wanted me to reiterate to my audience today that everything is about habitat, or everything is about landscape. I should rather say. If we don't have good habitat, we're not going to have wildlife. And we humans, we are also animals, and we depend on good habitat for our own species, for our own needs. So although the title of this presentation is about humans and wildlife in the American West and their history together, really a lot of today's presentation is going to be about land and habitat. We humans settling on the same habitat that wildlife live on, and how we can coexist, and how we've learned to coexist, I guess, over the last 200 years. So really quickly, we should all know this by now, but there was a myth that America, or North America, was an Eden prior to Euro-America settlement, that this was an untouched landscape. And of course, we know that humans have been humans have been a factor on the North American landscape for tens of thousands of years. People have lived here for millennia, and they've definitely had an impact on wildlife populations and the environment at large. So I don't want to overlook that. In the American West, we have, like I mentioned previously, a rich history of many peoples with different cultures and different nations living and sharing the landscape and warring over this landscape. We have everything from the Shoshones to the Utes, the Paiutes, the Goshutes, Navajos, Paiutes, Blackfeet, Cheyenne, Crow, Assiniboine, Teton Sioux, the Gros Ventre, the Hidatsa, just to name a few of the tribes that lived in this North American Cordillera, this Rocky Mountain spine that extends essentially from, in this presentation today, from the northern part of Arizona all the way up to the Canada border up in Idaho and Montana. These peoples, again, lived here. They interacted with wildlife. They had a deep relationship with the wildlife, the different species. And when Euro-Americans began to explore North America, as they began to move westward, they encountered a lot of these peoples. And some of these Euro-Americans appreciated the knowledge that the indigenous peoples had about the wildlife and the landscape, but tragically, the masses of the nation kind of overlooked or disparaged these peoples who called this place their home. In the early 1800s, after the Louisiana Purchase, Thomas Jefferson wanted to see if there was a navigable water route that would take Euro-Americans from the Pacific, or excuse me, from the Atlantic all the way to the Pacific. The Northwest, or the Pacific Northwest territories, were claimed by the British at that time, and Lewis and Clark were basically expeditionary leaders who were sent out to not only find trade routes, but also to interact with the indigenous peoples and to get a feel of how they acted with one another, to try and determine if they were peaceable, if there was animosity between Euro-Americans or tribes amongst tribes. And also Lewis and Clark, of course, were naturalists. They were sent out to explore the land and to find out what North America had. At the time, Thomas Jefferson believed that the Appalachian Mountains were perhaps the tallest mountains in North America. It was inconceivable for most to believe that there were mountains larger than the Appalachians, or to understand the amount of cultures that thrived to the west of the Appalachian Mountains. And Lewis and Clark's expedition, which went from 1803 to 1806, set out to understand a little bit about what the United States had procured through the Louisiana Purchase. Our story begins shortly after Lewis and Clark's expedition. Lewis and Clark, as they went out west, they went up through Montana and through Idaho and into the Pacific Northwest. They actually were north of Yellowstone National Park, or what we now acknowledge as Yellowstone National Park today. So they didn't explore anything that was relevant to that Yellowstone ecosystem, Tetons, Yellowstone National Park, and they also didn't get into the Southwest. However, the people who followed after the exploration party of Lewis and Clark really did begin to charter that landscape, those being the famous trappers or mountain men of the early 19th century. John Coulter was a member of the expedition of Lewis and Clark, and as that Lewis and Clark expedition came to a close, John Coulter, who was a frontiersman who was hired as a hunter for the Lewis and Clark expedition, he reached the headwaters, or he reached back to the headwaters of the Missouri, and he said, you know what, I didn't get enough of wilderness, I guess. I want to go back out into the woods and I want to explore. And so in 1807, he became the first known Euro-American to follow the Yellowstone River, which is a tributary of the Missouri River, and follow it to its headwaters into what is today known as Yellowstone National Park. So in 1807, you have this Euro-American trapper who's wandering through the Yellowstone wilderness in the dead of winter, and he's seeing for the first time these incredible geysers and these geothermal features that are so legendary today. John Coulter later was influential with the Rocky Mountain Fur Company, which is a period from 1822 to 1834, a really short window of when Americans began to organize a fur trading system, a trapping system where a company outfitted by investors from the East sent typically men out or boys out into the Western territories in order to harvest pelts or animal skins. This big push for trapping came from the fashion of making top hats or felt hats out of beaver skins. If you're not familiar with beavers or beaver skinning and processing, the pelt of a beaver has long guard hairs, and deep underneath, which helps insulate the animal, is a short insulating hair or a down hair. And in order to make felt hats, you basically would scrape that down fur, that insulating hair, and you'd compress it, and you would make it into these really stylish hats, these fur hats. It was all the rage in Europe and throughout the eastern United States to wear these hats, and this became a driving economic force that encouraged people to get rich quick by going out into the West and harvesting beavers. Beavers are the largest rodent that we have here in North America. They can reach up to 65 pounds, so as big as a golden retriever in some cases. And basically, your company would outfit you with traps, and you would go off into your own with your buddies, and you would set your traps anywhere. Beavers are universally found all across North America, or were historically, and you would set traps to try and catch these animals. In going after beavers, mountain men also interacted closely with a lot of different Native American tribes here in the Rocky Mountains, particularly with the Shoshone. The Shoshone Tribe, their territory by the beginning of the 19th century extended from basically Salt Lake all the way up to the high parts of the Yellowstone area. Sacagawea, if you're familiar with her, she was the guide for Lewis and Clark. She belonged to the Shoshone Tribe, and this tribe really enjoyed the benefits of trading and cohabitating with a lot of these Euro-Americans and establishing a rich trade system. Unfortunately, furs are a finite source, and although it was inconceivable to many people at the time, trapping beavers eventually led to their demise and eradication from most of the contiguous United States, or what we now recognize as the contiguous United States. And as trapping became more difficult because animals became more scarce, trappers, legendary trappers like Jim Bridger, had to seek means of employment elsewhere. And so Jim Bridger was perhaps the most famous mountain man. He, with his contemporaries, Jedediah Smith, Joe Meek, etc., if you've seen the movie The Revenant, Hugh Glass is based off of a true story, although the Hollywood kind of takes quite a lot of liberties. All these characters were larger than life, and they had a great appreciation for the wilds of the West, and they enjoyed the difficulties and the challenges in a way that is it's difficult for us to fully appreciate today. It's easy for us to look back and to criticize them for perhaps their avarice, for their misunderstanding of ecology, for their naivete of wildlife management. But at the time, they definitely enjoyed what they were doing. They loved the wild in their own way. Now, as the very brief period of fur trapping came to a close in the Rocky Mountains, we began to see expansion of more permanent Euro-American settlements, people moving from the east and dispersing across the landscape. Now, we had peoples, Euro-Americans, living on the Pacific coast, but really there was not a permanent fixed Euro-American settlement in the Intermountain West, in that what we now call Idaho, Utah, Wyoming, Montana, Colorado segment, until the Mormon Exodus, which took place in 1847. As I mentioned at the beginning, my family were Mormon converts, or members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Really quick, the church, just as a history, it originated in upstate New York City, upstate New York. Joseph Smith was the original founder of the church. They were a sect of Christians that were persecuted from state to state to state, from Ohio to Missouri, and eventually to Nauvoo, Illinois, the city that they founded. And after being persecuted from state to state to state for their beliefs, Joseph Smith and his brother were eventually martyred, and the newest leader of the Mormon Church, Brigham Young, who lived from 1801 to 1877, he basically said, you know what, if we can't live in the United States and have our religion protected, if we can't have our rights protected, then we're going to leave the United States. We're going to move west. We're going to go someplace where the United States government won't be able to harass us anymore, where the peoples won't be able to bother us anymore. So we're going to go out to Utah. Of course, it wasn't called Utah then, but what is now recognized as Utah was actually a part of Mexico. And so in 1847, there was a vast exodus of thousands, tens of thousands of Mormons, most of them coming as immigrants from Europe, and then spreading out west. They came here, and in case you can't recognize in this photograph, there has been a lot of changes since it was taken and today, but this is Salt Lake City. Yeah, believe it or not, there's Salt Lake City. There's its beginnings, its humble origins. Today, Mormons are associated with the state of Utah just because that's where the capital of the church is. That's where its headquarters is at. But again, Utah was non-existent back in the late 1840s and the 1850s. This was, again, a part of Mexico. It quickly became a territory after the Mexican War. But Brigham Young, who was an incredible person, whether you like him or not, he was fantastic in his ambitions. He decided to colonize and create a self-sustaining or self-sufficient people all up and down, again, the Intermountain West. And so, again, it was more than just what we now recognize as Utah that became settlement to these Euro-American settlers. Las Vegas, Nevada was originally a Mormon colony. Down along the Grand Canyon, all up through Utah, all the way up into Yellowstone, all the way up into Cardston, Alberta, actually. Mormons had a long chain of settlements, and they became independent. Again, a lot of these peoples were European immigrants, and they utilized their talents that they had developed in the old world, coming into the new world, into this wild American frontier. Was a pretty novel experience. My family on both sides came from Scandinavia, and they were shipwrights. And here in the Great Basin and up in Yellowstone, there was not really a need for building boats. And so they would basically utilize their skill as shipwrights to make roofs. They'd build a boat and then they'd flip it upside down, and they'd build a lot of their old pioneer buildings out of basically flipped upside down boats. And you can still see that today. This map conveys what was proposed as the state of Deseret in 1850, this large state that Brigham Young proposed the U.S. government make into a state. Obviously, it was rejected and it shrank. But if you've ever gone to the Southwest, if you've gone on natural habitat adventures expedition into the canyons, you'll recognize that there's a lot of Mormon history, a lot of influence in this area. In the Grand Canyon, which again was colonized on both sides by Mormon pioneers. Bryce Canyon, Ebenezer Bryce was a Mormon who settled right on the rim of this fantastic geologic anomaly. He's famous for having said that Bryce Canyon, that this area is a hell of a place to lose a cow. You can believe it. And of course, Zion National Park got its name from the Zion, the biblical term Zion, which is a foreordained place of peace and of harmony. The Mormons settled this canyon, and later it became a national park in 1919. Again, this is just something I want to touch on, just to remind you all that, of course, these lands were not unoccupied. There is a rich history of Fremont peoples, of ancestral Puebloans who were living in this area. And of course, during the time of the Mormon settlement in the American West, you also had the Utes and the Paiutes, and the Shoshone were some of the largest groups that the Mormons were interacting with. And a lot of those negotiations, those land settlements or contracts between different peoples, different cultures, were positive. And of course, there were a lot that were very tragic, and they ended in a lack of communication, or one people belittling the other people. And of course, the Euro-Americans ended up being the victors. This is a lovely painting that I like to share of Jacob Hamlin, who was famous for his abilities to work as a peacemaker with the Paiutes and with the Navajo. And as you have this Euro-American, this religious group, this Christian denomination that is settling in the American West, you have this really interesting blend of cultures. I like to throw this picture out here because it shows this marriage between two very different kinds of peoples who are trying to cooperate and collaborate together. Who knows how many of these people were baptized as Mormons, and who knows if they really knew what they were getting themselves into. But all the same, I really like this picture because it shows that here we have, for the first time in the American West, a permanent marriage between two peoples, trying to navigate different ideologies, different cultures, different ways of living. Mormons, just like most Euro-American settlers, they were planning on staying out here. This is the construction of what is today the temple that they have in Salt Lake, the famous Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints temple. They were planning on making an indelible impact on their landscape, and in doing so, they ultimately fragmented a lot of wildlife populations. Whether they understood what they were doing or not is up for debate, but definitely having a mass group of people with highly advanced technologies like rifles that they would utilize in order to make way for domestic livestock that would compete with wildlife really made a big dent on wildlife populations out here. In 1869, we of course had the Transcontinental Railroad. We had this now connection, this long thread or rope that connected the Californian coast with the American East. And as this railroad was completed, suddenly this area that was pretty much wild and untamed, if you want to describe it that way, was suddenly inundated with Euro-Americans who were moving out west, who wanted to explore and discover. One of the most famous explorers that we have is John Wesley Powell, who is a one-armed Civil War veteran, a geologist and ethnologist, who is one of also the founding fathers of National Geographic. He was the first person to lead an expedition down the Colorado River and into the Grand Canyon. His contributions over several years, discovering what value the Southwest had in terms of agrarian uses or geological prizes or geologic worth, really made a big difference on how the Southwest would be preserved later on down the road. His rhapsodies about the Grand Canyon, about the power of the rivers, and his observations of how those rivers influenced this arid landscape really set a course for how the future of the Southwest would be managed by the federal government as well as state governments. Now, as the Transcontinental Railroad was complete, again, you have more and more settlements popping up all over the place. No longer is it just the Mormons who have the monopoly over Euro-American settlement through the Intermountain West. Suddenly you have communities throughout Montana, throughout Idaho, and a lot of these peoples are homesteading. They're making themselves comfortable, and they're practicing farming. But it really wasn't until the 1870s that Yellowstone National Park was fully appreciated for what it was. Of course, the Native Americans living in the Yellowstone area knew about Yellowstone for millennia. The sheep eaters were a band of the Shoshone that inhabited that region. They were living there. They knew about the geysers, obviously. But starting with John Coulter in 1807 and a succession of mountain men and trappers, including the wonderful journalist Osborne Russell, we had a lot of stories coming out of this Coulter's Hell, or this Yellowstone region, describing what was found in that area, this incredible primeval wilderness rich with wildlife, fire and brimstone with geysers going off all over the place. But no one really understood or appreciated what Yellowstone was, and most characters out east were very skeptical about the reports that they heard. So much so that it took 2 credible expeditions into Yellowstone to finally bring full appreciation of the geologic wonders that Yellowstone had. One was done in the late 60s, early 70s of the 1800s, and then the most credible and famous of the expeditions was the Hayden expedition, which was launched by the U.S. Geological Survey in 1871. This expedition not only had scientists, biologists, botanists, geologists, but it also had artists like Thomas Moran, who captured these wonderful landscape scenes in his paints, and also the famous photographer Jackson was taking pictures of these events. Yellowstone was the first national park in the world, and it was created as a national park, not for its wildlife, but it was appreciated for its geological oddities. That's why if you look at Yellowstone National Park as a map today, it looks like a rectangle with some chunks taken out of it. And originally it was just a large rectangle. These land surveyors with the Hayden expedition basically marked up a boundary saying, hey, this land is unique, it's bizarre, and because it's a large volcano, there's very little that we could probably get out of this land as far as farming practices go or mining practices go. So they made a proposition to the Ulysses S. Grant administration in the 1870s that Yellowstone, which was in a territory, the Montana territory, be designated as a national park, a piece of land to be preserved and protected for the public at large. And in March 1st, 1972, without anyone even batting an eye, Ulysses Grant signed this paper, and Congress approved it, and Yellowstone became the world's first national park. this happened because Yellowstone was in a territory and not in a state. 10 years prior to Yellowstone, Yosemite was also designated as a public park, but it fell under the boundary of the state of California. And so Abraham Lincoln ordered that the state of California have jurisdiction over Yosemite, and it became a state park. But because Yellowstone was outside of a particular state's boundaries, it became a national park and set the precedent for future land preservation and acted as a sanctuary, as we'll soon talk about, for wildlife. Yellowstone back in 1870, 1880, 1890 was not the kind of Yellowstone that you would recognize today. Very quickly, people wanted, especially the railroads, wanted to advertise that Yellowstone was a new wonderland. Alice in Wonderland had just been published, and people really jumped on board of advertising or sending out propaganda to convince people to come on the railroad, on the trains to Yellowstone and to experience this odd landscape. And back then, people didn't really appreciate or understand much about preservation. And so again, their naivete caused them to mismanage or mispractice what we would define as conservation or preservation in this area. In fact, when Yellowstone National Park was first created, hunting was permitted in the park for the first couple of decades. Let me back up really quick, and just I guess I will jump forward just to help you understand the kind of landscape that Yellowstone was in 1877. This is a picture of Chief Joseph, who was one of the leaders of the Nez Perce tribe, or excuse me, Nez Perce tribe from the Pacific Northwest and the Walla Walla Valley. They were fleeing the U.S. government or the military at the time that the Yellowstone National Park was being visited by tourists, by wealthy Eastern American citizens who were coming out to take a dip in the natural geothermal features and to take buggy rides through the park and to go shooting elk and to hunt deer and to hunt other specimens of wildlife in Yellowstone National Park. While all these people were out vacationing, this was still very much a part of the Wild West arena. And in 1877, 5 years after Yellowstone had become a national park, there was an Indian War, which went straight through Yellowstone National Park. Chief Joseph was, again, one of the leaders of the Nez Perce tribe, or the Nimipus, as they call themselves, that were fleeing U.S. military aggression. The U.S. military was trying to force them onto a reservation off of their original lands, off of the lands of their fathers and their mothers. And this Indian War took place right inside Yellowstone National Park as these people were fleeing for their lives. That just shows you what kind of environment the early origins of Yellowstone National Park was involved in. There was a lot of lawlessness. There's a lot of mismanagement. Of course, during this time, as people began to move west, there is a lot of malpractice in conservation or an unawareness of conservation as people tried to practice farming or ranching out in the west. Bison, which were the most numerous of all of the North American species at the time, numbered probably around 30 million animals across the Great Plains. And as the railroad came west, it severed migration routes of these animals, and people would shoot them and kill them just for fun. They'd shoot them out of the trains and they'd leave them to die and to rot. Again, to reiterate what my friend Nicole, the habitat biologist, told me to remind you of, is that everything is about land. Today we think about wolves and people and bears and people and the conflicts that we have with bears and wolves and cougars eating our livestock. Well, bison were not eating our livestock. Bison were not eating our children. But bison had a huge footprint on the landscape, and they were competing with, or potentially competing with, domestic cattle and domestic sheep that we wanted to bring out west, and we were bringing out west. And so to begin with, more than the predators, we actually targeted these herbivores. So in the millions, we slaughtered bison in the tens of millions, and we slaughtered elk, and we slaughtered pronghorn antelope, and we slaughtered deer. We killed these animals because they got in our way, and also because we had access to all of these resources that would help make an individual rich. At the time, buffalo tongues were pickled and they were sold in Eastern American restaurants, and they were very popular. Buffalo skin robes were very popular, and so people were hired to go and eradicate these animals to make room for Western expansion, Western civilization. And in doing so, they decimated populations. And a lot of this was in the name of greed. Again, in Yellowstone National Park, we have documented cases all the way up into the 1890s of two brothers in particular who led a hunting outfitting expedition, or hunting outfitting company on the north end of Yellowstone, and in 1 year they killed between 2,000 and 4,000 elk, just the two of them. It's remarkable the amount of wanton waste that took place during what is known as the Great Slaughter of the 1800s, and it's tragic and it's horrifying. As we continue to exterminate a lot of these native ungulates, the predator population actually did really well. The predators were happy enough to gouge themselves on all of this carrion that we left lying out in the sun. Wolves and coyotes and bears glutted themselves on all of this rancid meat that was left to be consumed at their will, at their leisure. But as the native wildlife populations declined, suddenly you had a boost in your carnivore population. And then when there was no more native wildlife to eat, all of these predators turned to eating livestock. And you hear a lot about the decimation, or excuse me, the predation, rather, the depredation that was taking place on ranchers' sheep or their cattle due to wolves or to cougars or to bears. And some of those figures are pretty astronomical, but a lot of them are credible too, because there was nothing left to eat, and you suddenly had a surplus of carnivores on the landscape. So people began to turn their attention to killing predators and to mitigating their populations. The last of the bison really dwindled down to a bottleneck here in Yellowstone National Park, where we had, depending on the records that you're looking at, probably as little as 22 bison left in that region of the country. We had gone from approximately 30 million animals to about 1,000 left over all of North America in just a matter of a couple of decades. That gratuitous slaughter is unfathomable, really. And tragically, as these species became more and more rare, the poaching of these species became more and more coveted. These buffalo heads here were confiscated from a poacher in Yellowstone National Park. These are the American military officers. The American military was called in to help protect Yellowstone and its resources and to end hunting with the Lacey's Act in Yellowstone National Park. And really, it came down to a point where we had to decide as a country how we were going to best protect our remaining wildlife, how we were going to protect our landscapes, how we were going to protect our natural resources. And this is where one figure in history stands head and shoulders above the rest in terms of what he did for our nation and for the planet. Because now a lot of these areas that we value so much are World Heritage Sites, and they mean a lot not just to us Americans, but to people all over the world. Theodore Roosevelt, the 26th president, he was vice president, and when President McKinley was assassinated, he suddenly was bumped into office as president. He was a famous hunter, a famous naturalist. In his day and age, he was considered someone born a generation too late, and how grateful we are as a people to have had him born during the time that he was born. If he had been born a generation earlier, he probably would have been a cowboy. He probably would have just been a rancher or a hunter, and he wouldn't have been any different from Jim Bridger or the rest of those charismatic Americans that went before him. But he was born perhaps a generation too late. He wanted to be a rancher. He wanted to be a great hunter. He was alive when these characters from history were still alive, but they were breathing their last. And as he emulated them, he realized that the tragedy of the commons in America was that our natural resources were not protected, and that greed and avarice were destroying our natural resources. Whether you like Theodore Roosevelt or not, whether you agree with his policies, he did some things that were perhaps jingoistic. He definitely did things that were racist. But as a conservationist, what he did for this country is unparalleled, and we celebrate him for that for sure. This is a quote that I'd like to read from him, even though I'm getting on in this presentation today, but I think this is a great reflection of what he had to say about preservation in America and how we should protect the West. He said, "Defenders of the short-sighted men who in their greed and selfishness will, if permitted, rob our country of half its charm by their reckless extermination of all useful and beautiful wild things, sometimes seek to champion them by saying that the game or the wildlife belongs to the people. So it does, and not merely to the people now alive, but to the unborn people. The greatest good for the greatest number applies to the number within the womb of time, compared to which those now alive form but an insignificant fraction. Our duty to the whole, including the unborn generations, bids us to restrain an unprincipled present-day minority from wasting the heritage of these unborn generations. The movement for the conservation of wildlife and the larger movement for the conservation of all our natural resources are essentially democratic in spirit, purpose, and method." Theodore Roosevelt was an aristocrat. He lived in a situation where he wanted to participate and did participate as a rancher and as a hunter. Excuse me. But he recognized that if people continued to greedily gobble up lands, forests, wildlife for their own personal greed, that the commons, the people at large, would lose, that there wasn't enough to go around. He recognized that bison numbers were in particular vanishing, and he wanted to do everything he could to try and turn that around. So he, as a conservationist, as a hunter, created and co-authored the North American model of wildlife conservation, among many things. The doctrine of this conservation movement focused on the democracy of all natural resources, including wildlife, that wildlife belongs to everyone. It's a public trust doctrine, that the governments of states and federal agencies were responsible for managing and protecting wildlife for all citizens, that you couldn't buy or purchase wildlife, that you couldn't buy or purchase game meat, wild meat for sale, and that these species needed to be protected because they belong to everyone, and not just his contemporaries, but for future citizens as well. The Roosevelt Doctrine also focused on conservation through wise use and ownership as a public trust, that sure, we can utilize our natural resources to improve our country, but we need to do it responsibly and we need to be wise. And the third principle is that science is the proper tool for discharging that responsibility. It's not about opinion. It's not about sofa biology. It's not about just throwing your opinions out there or your observations. It's about real science making the decisions. And again, Theodore Roosevelt was a hunter. I have another presentation about managing wildlife in the American West. And a lot of people, a lot of conservationists, sadly don't understand the role that hunting has as a conservation tool in the U.S. Model for wildlife preservation and conservation. Because of Theodore Roosevelt and his big push to preserve wildlife, eventually the Pittman and Robinson Act was created in 1937, which provides funding for the restoration and improvement of wildlife habitat for wildlife management and research. Funds for the act come from an 11% federal excise tax on sporting arms, ammunition, and archery equipment, as well as a 10% tax on handguns. So Theodore Roosevelt realized that his contemporaries and his generation of wildlife enthusiasts were mostly made up of hunters. Of course, times have changed, and now non-consumptive use of wildlife, like wildlife tours and bird watching and hiking and recreating, are more popular than hunting. But in his day, it was the hunters and the fishermen, the anglers, who were most enthusiastic about wildlife. And so he realized that in order to protect wildlife, it was those constituents who needed to get on board and walk the walk, not just talk the talk. At this time, we began to crank down on more protection of our bison. I'm going to skip through that really quick. Theodore Roosevelt also did a lot to protect our national lands. In fact, the Pittman and Robinson Act, I should have mentioned, has to date put over $11 billion towards wildlife management and research in the United States. So it definitely has had its monetary impact. And Theodore Roosevelt also worked to create the Antiquities Act of his administration, which set aside lands like the Grand Canyon to protect them from, again, the avarice of people. Theodore Roosevelt protected over 200 million acres during his administration, which is over 1/3 of all public lands that we have today, again, through his administration, which is pretty incredible. When going to the Grand Canyon, he confronted political opponents who wanted to dam the Grand Canyon. They wanted to mine in the Grand Canyon. And Roosevelt said in his famous speech, "I want to ask you to keep this great wonder of nature as it is now. I hope that you will not have a building on it of any kind, not a summer cottage, a hotel, or anything else to mar the wonderful grandeur, the sublimity, the great loneliness and beauty of the canyon. Leave it as it is. You cannot improve on it. The ages have been at work on it, and man can only mar it." And under his administration, the canyon was protected as a national monument and later as a national park. Another individual that we need to quickly mention is George Byrd Grinnell, who was very influential as a mentor in some ways to Theodore Roosevelt. George Byrd Grinnell was a conservationist, a hunter. He helped found the North American Model for Wildlife Conservation, as well as the Boone and Crockett Club. But he, as a biologist, as an ethnologist, he really appreciated the indigenous peoples of the Northern Rocky Mountains and came to love and know Glacier National Park and pushed for its preservation and conservation as much as others were pushing for the continued preservation of Yellowstone National Park. And in 1910, Glacier National Park was protected as a national park. Now, from 1872 until 1916, national parks were created as public places for the public's enjoyment. But there wasn't really a service or an agency responsible for managing those parks. In fact, a lot of the management was under the jurisdiction of the military or the army. The army was supposed to patrol and protect the parks. But in 1916, the National Park Service was created. Stephen Mather was the first superintendent of the Park Service, and he really began to push for the idea that public lands, and not just lands, but wildlife, belong to the community at large, and that we should create and protect national parks as a heritage for our generation and for future generations. This quote is from Ken Burns' National Parks documentary series, which I highly recommend. But it kind of encompasses what national parks mean to us. National parks became the last refuge for magnificent species of animals that otherwise would have vanished forever. And they remain a refuge for human beings seeking to replenish their spirit, geographies of memory and hope where countless American families have forged an intimate connection with their land and then passed it along to their children. Wildlife move. Wildlife come and go as they migrate across the landscape, following the changing seasons and the change of resources and droughts and winters. This was underappreciated when national parks were first being created. Nevertheless, these parks, these oddities, these boundaries of wilderness that we are setting aside were intended to protect wildlife, and as inadequate as they were to protect entire ecosystems, they still serve their purpose in protecting many species of wildlife, including the bison, and as well as the grizzly bear, which we'll talk about in a second, from ultimate extinction, from annihilation. Grizzly bears, I've given a presentation on their distribution across North America in the West, but grizzly bears used to live everywhere, essentially, in the American West, from California all the way down into central Mexico, through Arizona, New Mexico, Colorado. But again, as more and more confrontations took place between humans trying to protect their livestock from these large carnivores, and weapons technologies advanced, grizzly bear populations collapsed. And of course, wolf and cougar populations also dwindled. People had no respect or appreciation for the role that these animals played on the ecosystem or the environment. This is, again, a part of the naivete of the times. People didn't realize that carnivores help the ecosystem be healthy, that they have an intrinsic value in the wilderness. It really wasn't until Aldo Leopold, who is considered the father of modern wildlife management, came along, when he began to talk about and help share the sentiments and kind of awaken this this dormant underappreciation of wildlife's biodiversity as a whole, that things began to change. Aldo Leopold grew up as a student of forestry, as a biologist, and he believed, like his contemporaries, that predators, cougars, wolves, and bears were wrong, and that if they could be eradicated, then the world would be a better place. That carnivores were a nuisance, a plague on the earth. But as he began to mature, Aldo Leopold changed his sentiments. He talks here in this quote about being a young man, being hired out on the Kaibab Plateau on the Arizona Strip, just above the north rim of the Grand Canyon, to hunt wolves, to extirpate them, to eradicate them from that landscape. But as a young man shooting these animals, he began to realize that fewer wolves would not necessarily mean more hunting opportunities. He has this famous line saying that as he watched the green fire die in a wolf's eyes that he had shot, he sensed that the wolf and the mountain did not agree with his worldview, that there was a purpose for having carnivores on the landscape. Fortunately for bears, there was more tolerance for them than there were for for wolves and cougars, which were almost systematically eradicated from much of their historic range. Nevertheless, bears were mismanaged, and we didn't appreciate how dangerous they could be, but also what role they played in the environment if they behaved naturally rather than were simply utilized as forms of entertainment. Some of you maybe visited Yellowstone back before the 1970s, and this was a common sight. People would feed panhandling bears, and they'd throw scraps of food out. But now we know better. We used to have garbage dumps where we would leave food out for grizzlies to go and gorge themselves on. But it wasn't until really the 1960s when biologists like the Craighead brothers, John and Frank, began pioneering research and understanding the environment as a whole that we suddenly began to change the tune of our song and realize that the National Park Service, whether it be Grand Canyon, Zion, Yellowstone, or Glacier National Park, the National Park Service had an obligation to try and protect its wildlife resources, not just its geologic resources, and that a natural form of managing these wildlife species was an important role that the Park Service had, not only for the human constituents that enjoyed these parks, but also for the preservation of these quickly vanishing wilderness areas. Thankfully, we created in 1973 the Endangered Species Act, and following the recommendation that Aldo Leopold had offered 50 years before this event, we decided to reintroduce large carnivores, and not just large carnivores, but any species that had been eradicated from an environment or from an ecosystem previously. And beginning in the mid-90s, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service began reintroducing wolves back into the lower 48 states. This species had been absent from this region for 70 years, and here we are, the same organizations, the same governments that had eradicated them are now working together in a cooperative effort to try and recover these species. Federal lands are, and public lands at large, are a huge keystone to the preservation of biodiversity. We need these lands to be preserved, not just for our own enjoyment, but for the integrity of the ecosystem at large. Sadly, these public lands are not always appreciated as they should be, and sometimes they come under vehement attack by people who think that these lands should belong to private individuals to be utilized for their own gain. That we should be operating under a utilitarian dictate or agenda rather than just from a conservation or a multi-use agenda. In the 70s, in the 80s, in the 90s, and continuing today, we often hear in the news about these sagebrush rebellions which take place in the West. I hold my opinion on a lot of things because I think that a lot of environmental issues are complicated, and I think that it's important for us to understand the value of both sides of the story in every controversial issue. But with sagebrush rebellions that I see a lot here in the West, with people who attack the federal government, who act in a lawless way to try and get lands put back into the hands of private citizens, I don't have a lot of patience for that. Sadly, it's prevalent out here in the West, though. We have a lot of animosity towards that federal government or towards conservation agendas, and I hope that we can all unite together and push back against that and continue to see our natural resources preserved and managed. To end my presentation today, I just want to acknowledge that humans now, today, in our 21st century, we dominate the earth. We're everywhere, and so wildlife depend on our ability to make decisions that do not compromise their existence. The tragedy is that we have grown to be so impactful on this planet that we can't just be hands off. I'm a wildlife biologist, and I work with the public, and the public often will make naive critiques of wildlife biology and research, and they will say, you know, you're meddling with something that God should be handling. We need to be hands off. I appreciate that sentiment, that we want the world to be as natural as possible, but unfortunately we've reached a point in our time in history where we need to consciously be proactive about protecting the environment. We need to be proactive in protecting wilderness and the species that depend on wilderness. Without serious attention to the management of wildlife, life as we know it will cease to exist because human civilization can destroy it. We've reached that point. That being said, we have seen incredible comebacks of species that were almost annihilated as the American West was being colonized by Euro-Americans. Grizzly bear populations have increased tremendously. We've reintroduced wolves, and their populations are doing great. Bison have come back from the brink of extinction. Elk populations have come back. Today is known as the age of the elk because of how many elk we have. This story of the American West and our interaction with it is not novel. People, no matter what culture or background or ethnicity they have, people everywhere have had an impact on the environment. Wildlife was rich in biodiversity everywhere, but times have changed. What has awesome about the American West and what we have seen is that in the last 100 years, we have worked progressively, vigorously to try and conserve what we have. And fortunately, with a lot of great people, and I covered some of their profiles in this presentation today. I missed a lot of very important people, unfortunately, but fortunately, we caught the ball before we dropped it. But now we got to act. Now that we have the ball, now that wildlife has been conserved, that we have protected lands, that we have protected wildlife from being annihilated across this wonderful continent. Now we have to continually be proactive and progressive in making sure that we learn to coexist with it and that we continue to protect it and cherish it. And I'll leave you, I've gone over my allotted amount of time. I always do that. I'll leave you with this final quote from Theodore Roosevelt, who said so many quotable things, but here is your country. Cherish these natural wonders. Cherish the natural resources. Cherish the history and the romance as a sacred heritage for your children and for your children's children. Do not let selfish men or greedy interests skin your country of its beauty, its riches, or its romance. And that is that.
Thank you, Aaron. Never worry about going over your time. This was great. I will take questions now, and I just like to remind everyone watching, if you have a question or a comment for Aaron, you can submit those in the control panel under the questions field. Okay, first question is, someone's wondering if there should be some sort of tax on tourist-related activities similar to that of taxes related to hunting in order to subsidize protection, enforcement, and habitat improvement.
The short answer is yes, there should be, in my opinion. In my presentation that I gave on managing wildlife in America, I talk a lot more about how the financing and the funding of wildlife conservation happens. So I encourage you to look at that presentation if you're interested in learning more. Long story short, wildlife conservation was born when hunting was really popular in the country. It's less popular now, and there are more of us interested in participating in non-consumptive wildlife activities or appreciative activities. We don't have a very good system for including what we call non-traditional stakeholders, or like bird watchers, nature watchers, wildlife adventurers like you folks. It would be fantastic if we could have a mild or a minor tax on recreational equipment like backpacks and binoculars and tents and hiking boots and running shoes. That would help wildlife in America tremendously. But no one wants a new tax. So let's figure out how we can shift this financial burden to some of the non-traditional stakeholders who are willing to share that burden of conservation.
So the next is, this talk was of a constant change over the past 250 years. What kind of changes can you see that need to or will be made in the next 50 years?
The biggest issues in the American West that we face outside of climate change is habitat fragmentation. I didn't talk about it in this because I ran out of time, but in my lifetime, I have seen some of the Western states double in population. Again, I mentioned that my family has been out here for 7 generations, and communities like Jackson Hole are young, actually. It's kind of funny, we always tease because my family's from the opposite side of the Tetons. And people ask, well, why didn't your family settle over in what is today Jackson Hole? Because we'd obviously be millionaires if we owned some of that land. And the answer is that that side of the mountain was freezing. People couldn't farm it, they couldn't ranch it. The conditions were too miserable. Today, you can work comfortably in an office. And so it makes sense for some people to develop mountain communities, to build ski resorts, to get closer to nature, which I can very much appreciate. But tragically, the irony is that by moving closer and closer to nature, we are severing wildlife corridors. We're removing wildlife habitat that is necessary for the successful expansion of our wildlife. We have more bison now than we had 100 years ago. We have more elk now than we had 100 years ago, more wolves, more cougars. But these animals want to continue to expand, and we as humans are continually encroaching on their habitat, or the habitat that they need, which causes more and more conflicts. So in the next 50 years, the biggest issues that we have is the protection and conservation of lands that will keep wilderness wild, that will give wildlife places to live and roam.
Great. And the last question I'll take today is if you could comment a little bit on the recent repeal of protecting wolves.
So next week on the 19th, I'm going to be giving a presentation on the delisting of the gray wolf in the lower 48 states. So I will go into a lot of detail next Thursday on the 19th when I give an hour of my time to addressing that issue. I work with wolves, and I research wolves up in the Yellowstone and Idaho and Wyoming area. I am getting a PhD studying wolves in those environments as well. It's very controversial, and without giving away next week's presentation, I will say that wolves biologically are very adaptable. They are capable of doing well, and they have been doing well. In fact, mean rates of wolf fecundity or rates of increase can be as much as 20% annually. So wolves are not endangered of going extinct. They are not imperiled. And the science does support the delisting of the wolf for that reason. The criticisms really get messy when people look at the agenda that the Fish and Wildlife Service has in determining whether or not the wolf is fully recovered. There's still a lot of historic habitat where wolves used to live that they can live and they can occupy, but they're not occupying. Obviously, wolves live across a huge range in North America historically, and we can't have them live everywhere that they used to live, because we as humans have removed their natural prey, we've removed their food source, we've encroached on habitat that they are no longer able to utilize, but we still have a lot of wild places that don't have wolves that could have wolves. So that's where a lot of the legal issues and the criticisms take place. Is should we delist the wolf right now when there are still ranges, still areas of habitat that they could inhabit that they don't yet inhabit? Are we delisting them too soon? And on the flip side, to support the delisting, the species is not endangered. It's not threatened. It's not imperiled. So why are we protecting it as an endangered or a threatened species if it isn't imperiled? We'll talk more about it next week. It's a sticky issue.
Yeah, complicated. Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Aaron. This was wonderful and really inspiring. That is all the time we have for questions today. So I'd like to hand it back over to you for some closing comments.
Thank you for participating. Again, this was a subject that I wanted to talk about because, again, my family's been in the West for so long. It means a lot to me, this American legacy. I love the Rocky Mountains. They're my home, and I'm dedicating my life to protecting and conserving what wildness we still have here in the American continent. I appreciate you for listening in. I know that this is 200 years in an hour is a lot of information, and I went over it pretty quickly. Hopefully I didn't lose any of you. But if I could have you walk away with anything, it would be to appreciate the lands that we have and the people who have gone before us to work to preserve those lands, and recognize that those natural resources are still precious today, perhaps now more than ever. And the fight is now on our shoulders to continue to be proactive, to be educated. The media so often oversimplifies things. So please be educated and do your homework and become proactive on issues that mean a lot to all of us. And the environment is certainly an issue that means a lot to all of us. So get out there and do good.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Aaron. And my thanks as well to everyone who tuned in today. Be sure to join us tomorrow for our next Daily Dose of Nature. We did record today's presentation and we'll have the replay available on our website soon. And with that, I'll conclude the webinar. Goodbye, everybody.